Hey everyone, it's Chris with King Grizzly. Elementor gives you some really nice carousel widgets for showcasing your content in a slider, but did you know that you can actually supercharge your carousels and unlock some features that aren't normally available in Elementor? Take a look at this carousel here. I've enabled a really slick parallax effect on it, where you can see that all the elements on each slide come into view at different speeds, creating this nice smooth animated effect. Now, it's not something that's normally available in Elementor, but I'm going to show you how you can do it without any additional software or plugins. So if you're ready to find out more, let's get started. Elementor uses the open source Swiper library to build its carousels, and Swiper actually has a lot more functionality than Elementor chooses to make available in its editor. I previously made a video on how you can build your own controls for Elementor carousels and place them anywhere on the page, and in that video I talked a bit more about what Swiper actually is and how we can tap into its API to unlock additional features. So if you want to take a look at that video first, I'll put a link in the description down below. So, with that said, let's get started on building our carousel parallax effect. I'll put a link below as well in the description where you can download this whole demo and easily install it on your own site, so don't worry if you have trouble following along. Now, first of all, a quick disclaimer before we start. You're going to need Elementor Pro to follow along with this tutorial. While it will theoretically work with the free version of Elementor, and it should work with any of the carousel widgets in Elementor, there is actually only one carousel available in the free version of Elementor, and it's an image carousel that doesn't really lend itself that well to this parallax effect. So if you don't already have Elementor Pro, you really should consider using it due to its modest cost, and in return you get a really nice enhanced set of functionality and some really nice additional widgets that will really allow you to elevate your website builds. So check the description below the video and there'll be a link down there where you can try it out and download it. So before we start building our Parallax carousel solution, a few things to check. First of all, we need to make sure that our WordPress and plugins are actually up to date. So as of the time of making this video, you can see that my current version of WordPress is 6.4.1. So make sure your version of WordPress is up to date with whatever the latest version is. And then in the plugins, let's have a look at Elementor and Elementor Pro. My version is 3.17.3 of Elementor and 3.17.1 of Elementor Pro. So again, make sure that you're up to date on both versions. The only other thing to check is that you have the upgrade swiper library featured in Elementor. So if you come over to Elementor settings and then switch over to the features tab, if you scroll down, you should find that there's a feature here called Upgrade Swiper Library. So it's already active on my installation, but make sure that's active on yours. Elementor have recently updated the version of the Swiper API that they're using, so you'll find that this is probably deactivated by default on your installation of Elementor, but on a future release this will be active by default, and it's best to activate it now because the code that we're about to write won't work properly otherwise, and it will be active by default in future anyway, so we want to make sure that our functionality continues working in future. So make sure this is set to active and then come down and save your changes here. Okay, so we're now ready to start building our carousel. So let's go and create a new Elementor page. Now I've already created a page here for this demo, Parallax carousel demo, so let's edit with Elementor. Now on this page you'll see that I've already placed a carousel. Now this is the new carousel widget, which is a really nice widget which lets you basically use the Elementor editor to create any content you want on each slide. So in the past you had to build an image carousel or you had to create templates and insert them into the slides, but now you can place the carousel widget on your page and actually use the editor to build whatever content you want in each slide. So I'll quickly show you how I did this. We'll search for the carousel and we'll place it on the page. And then in this carousel you get a number of slides. You can copy them, duplicate them, and then within each slide, like you can see here in the navigator, you can actually edit content directly on the slide, so you can start adding widgets directly to the slide. So we can put a heading on here, for example, or we can place an image on the second slide, and we can use the normal Elementor editor to put whatever content we want on the slide. So I won't build that content now because I don't want this to be a video about building content. I want to show you the code that we're going to build to actually enable this parallax effect. So I'm going to delete this carousel for now. So let's move that out of the way and delete. Okay, and here's the carousel that I built earlier, and this is the one that we're going to use in our demo. Okay, so once you've built the carousel and you've got the content on your slides, there are just two things that we need to do. Firstly, we need to give our carousel a class name because that will make it easier to reference in our code. So if you select the carousel and go to the Advanced tab, you'll see down here I've given this carousel a class name of Parallax Carousel. So you can call that whatever you want. The second thing we need to do is we need to define the speed at which we want each element on each slide to scroll into view. So if we switch over to the Swiper API, you'll see here in the API documentation, what we basically need to do is we need to add a data attribute to every element that we want to slide in at a different speed. So if we come down here, you can see effectively that we have this data swiper parallax attribute that we need to add to each element, and the value that we need to give it is the number of pixels that we want to offset it by as the slide comes into view. So you don't need to worry too much about how this works, but basically if you define a different number for each element, then they will basically slide into view at different rates. So here you've got minus 100 pixels, on the second element you've got minus 200, and down here you've got minus 300. So if we switch back to the Elementor editor, adding a data attribute is actually something you can do directly from the Elementor editor. Now I think this is actually quite an underused feature and it's really useful in a lot of scenarios, and I'm not sure that everyone knows that it's even there, but we're going to be able to do this right now in the Elementor editor. So let's go to our first slide, and here we are on slide number 1. We want the headings to slide in one after the other on the first slide. So let's click the first heading. Now if you go over to the Advanced tab over here and come down, you'll see that there's this attribute section, and you can actually add an HTML attribute to any element you want. So here we can directly add in what it was telling us to add in that Swiper API. So if we add an attribute called data swiper parallax and then the pipe symbol, then all we need to do is specify the value after the pipe. So I'm going to give it a value of minus 300. Like I say, you can play around with these values and you'll get different parallax effects, but let's give the first one a value of minus 300. If we come down to the second heading and do the same thing, you can see down here under attributes, I've put the same attribute in and given that a value of minus 600, and then on the third element, I've given it a value of minus 900. So if we move on to the second slide, so we'll go over to the navigator and move on to the second slide. So we've got 3 elements on here. What I'd like to do is I'd like to slide the first heading in first, followed by the second heading, and then make the image slide in after these 2 headings. So it kind of slides in across the front of the 2 headings to give a really nice animated effect. So we do the same thing again. We select the first heading, we give that a data swiper parallax attribute of minus 300, second heading is minus 600, and then finally the image will give that an attribute with a value of minus 900. And then finally on slide number 3 we just have 3 images. So I'd like these images to come in one after the other, so they kind of follow one another as they come onto the screen. So we'll just do the same thing again, but we'll give this one an attribute of 300, or rather minus 300, this one an attribute value of minus 600, and this one a value of minus 900. So once you've added that class name to the carousel and you've added all your data attributes to all of the elements on the slides, simply save your changes and then we're ready to move on to the next step. Okay, so what have we actually built so far? Well, let's switch over to the front end of our page and take a look. So at the moment we just have a carousel with 3 slides, and at the moment it just acts like a normal carousel. We can navigate between the 3 slides, but obviously there's no parallax effect at the moment. So let's switch back to the Elementor editor, and now we're going to add some JavaScript to actually enable that parallax effect. Now the code we're about to write will involve some more intermediate JavaScript concepts, but you don't necessarily need to fully understand what's going on, as you can download this demo from the description below the video and get it working on your own site without understanding how the code works. But nonetheless, I'm going to explain what I'm doing as I'm going along for those who are interested in how it works, or for those who want to learn a bit more about JavaScript. So let's add an HTML widget to our page, and from that widget we can add our JavaScript. So we search for HTML and we'll drop it on the page. And now let's expand the view so we can see what we're doing a bit better. Okay, so as with any JavaScript, let's start by opening our script tags. And then, because we're going to be using jQuery, we want to wait until the page or the document is ready to accept JavaScript code. So as with all jQuery, we'll start with the line of jQuery document ready function, and then if we define $, just here we can then use $, in the following code to reference jQuery instead of typing jQuery each time. So let's come down here, end with a semicolon. Right, so we're now ready to start writing our code. Now the first thing we're going to need to do, because we're manipulating the instance of Swiper that's on the page, is we're going to need to make sure that Swiper has actually fully loaded on the page before we start trying to manipulate it. Otherwise we'll end up with all kinds of errors. So the Elementor development framework actually features what they call JavaScript hooks, which let you hook into Elementor at key points to implement your own code. So for example, you could hook in when the front end of Elementor has finished initializing, or when all the components have loaded and are ready. Now we could use this approach to hook our code in at a point after which we know Swiper has definitely loaded, but honestly I've not found the results of using this approach to be that reliable, so what we're going to do is write our own function that will check to see when the Swiper component has appeared on the page, and only then will we run our code. So by taking this approach, it also means that our code will continue to work if Elementor ever changes their own framework or changes the way their JavaScript hooks work. Therefore, the first thing we want to do is write a function that actually waits for Swiper to exist on the page, or in the DOM, or the document object model as it's called. So let's start writing that function first of all. So we'll call it wait for Swiper, and it will be a function, and it'll have 2 parameters. Now the first parameter will be the selector, so this is the Swiper element that's on the page, and we'll actually pass a reference to this into the function. So that's the first parameter, and the second parameter will be a callback function. So this will be a function that will actually run once the selector, or the first parameter, exists on the page. So we'll call this callback. So let's put our curly brace there, and let's end this correctly, like so. Let's just remove that extra curly brace there, because we don't need that there. So what do we actually want to do here? Well, we want to say, if the Swiper element exists on the page, then we want to run the function that we're going to pass in, and we're going to write that in a moment, i.e. the callback function, which is the second parameter. If it doesn't exist yet, then we want to wait a short amount of time and then try again. So we want to wait for, say, 100 milliseconds and then try again. So let's first of all write that test to see if that selector or that Swiper object exists yet. So we'll come up here and we'll say if $selector, and then within that element there's an object called Swiper that contains all the data about the Swiper instance, so that's the thing that we want to check to make sure that it exists. So if swiper, so that's basically saying that if it's not null, in other words, it exists. Now, the problem here is that this is a jQuery object, and we actually want to access the swiper HTML element that's within our jQuery object. And jQuery object is basically like a wrapper around several elements. So if we want to access the swiper HTML element rather than the jQuery object, then we need to use array notation, and we need to access the first element of that object. So what we actually need to say here is if selector first element, which is a 0. So if that has some kind of length, if it's not null, then we know that it exists, and then we're ready to run our callback function. So if that's true, then we simply run the callback function, like so. However, if that swiper element doesn't exist yet, then we want to wait 100 milliseconds and try again. So we need to say else, and we need to create a timeout to wait for 100 milliseconds. So we say set timeout function and then what do we want to do after 100 milliseconds? We want to recursively call the same function again and pass in exactly the same parameters, so it basically runs again and tests once more to see whether it exists yet. So we call wait for swiper again, and we pass in the selector and the callback function. And then we come down here and we define for this timeout what we want the period to be. And as I said, that should be 100 milliseconds. Semicolon to end the line. Okay, so that's the function complete. What we're doing here is we're creating a function that we can call. We can pass in two parameters. We can pass in the selector that represents the swiper object, and we can pass in a callback function that we want to run. So once that selector exists, we run the callback function, and if it doesn't exist, we wait and recursively call the function again. And that keeps happening until it does exist, and then eventually the code will run. So let's move on and write that code now. So what do we actually want to do with our code? Well, let's give a quick overview of what we're going to do next. So the first thing we need to do is we need to grab an instance of that swiper object that's already on the page. The next thing we need to do is we need to take a copy of the parameters that are inside that swiper object, because we've already created a lot of settings and parameters when we built the carousel back in the Elementor editor. So we don't want to lose those, so we want to take a copy of them, and then once we've got a copy of them, we want to update them to enable the parallax effect, because that's disabled by default in Swiper, so we're going to enable it. And then finally, we're going to initialize a new instance of Swiper and set all the same parameters that existed on the original Swiper instance. So you can actually change certain parameters by updating them directly, and they will take effect immediately. So if, for example, you wanted to change the number of slides that are visible on the screen, or you want to change the transition speed between the slides, we could simply update those parameters on our Swiper object and the change would take effect immediately. And if you watch my previous video on how to build your own controls for Elementor Carousels, that's exactly what we did there. But unfortunately, if you want to do something more complex, like enabling this parallax effect, then unfortunately that doesn't work, because the change to the underlying Swiper object is too fundamental. So the only way to achieve it is to build an entirely new instance of Swiper. But that's a problem, right? Because Elementor has already created our instance of Swiper on the page. So how do we achieve this? Well, the approach we're going to take is that we grab the parameters from the existing object, like I say, and then that obviously makes sure that we don't lose any of the settings we made back in the Elementor editor. We update those parameters to enable the parallax effect, and then we create a brand new instance of Swiper using those duplicated parameters with the effect, the parallax effect switched on, and then we initialize that new Swiper instance over the top of the old one. So let's get started with that code. So we've already written our function that will wait until Swiper exists on the page. So the first thing we want to do is actually call that. So we come down here and we call our function called wait for Swiper. And we know that that function has two parameters. Firstly, it's the instance of swiper, the selector that represents the instance of swiper, and the second function is our callback function. So that's all the code that we want to run once we know that swiper exists on the page. So first parameter is the swiper instance. So we can refer to that using the class name that we gave our carousel back in Elementor. So we called that Parallax carousel, and inside that there's an element with a class name of swiper, and Elementor creates this. So that's what we need to pass in. So we refer to that class of swiper. And then the second parameter is the callback function. So here's the function. Let's give a semicolon down here. Right, now we're ready to actually write the code that we want to run once we know swiper exists on the page. So the first thing we want to do is actually grab an instance of that swiper object, and we can do that using a jQuery selector. So let's store that in a variable, and we'll call that carousel, because this is basically our carousel, and we can select it with the $, and then we know that it's called Parallax carousel, or the class name is Parallax carousel, and inside that is an element with the class name of swiper. So that grabs our instance of the swiper object. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the jQuery object is effectively like an array-like wrapper around several elements. So in order to get the actual HTML element out of this, we need to reference the first element of that array. So let's create another variable, and we'll call this one carousel swiper. And that simply takes the variable that we created on the line above, and it just takes the first element from it, like so. So the next thing we need to do is extract the parameters from the carousel swiper object that we've just created. Now, we could do the following. Carousel, let's create a new variable called carousel params, and we could just say carousel swiper dot params, because that's the name of the property on that object. Now, that probably won't actually work, because the problem with creating an object like this is that you're creating an object by reference, not by value. So if you create a reference to it, that means that if the original parameters object changes, then our copy will also change, because it's just a reference. Now that could be a problem, because we're going to destroy that instance of swiper shortly and initialize our new version over the top of it. So what we actually want to do is create a complete copy of it, a copy by value, not by reference. So the best way to do that is to create an entirely new object. So we can amend this line by adding new object, and then we just take the value of it. So we say value of, and that will create us a new object that is a copy by value, not by reference. And then we can do whatever we want with this parameters object, and we'll be able to pass that into our new instance of swiper, which we're about to create shortly. So now we have our own new copy of the parameters object, we can now set the parallax property to be enabled. So all we have to do now is reference our new carousel params object and set the parallax property equal to true. So now what we have is a copy of the original carousel's parameters. They're all the same, it's just a duplicate, but with the one additional change that we've set the parallax property to true. So the final step is now just to create a new instance of swiper and initialize it over the top of the old instance, because like I said before, we can't just amend this parallax property to true. We need to reinitialize the carousel as an entirely new instance of swiper. So let's do that now. So we'll call that new carousel, and we'll create a new swiper object, and that swiper object takes two parameters. The first parameter is basically the location where you want to initialize it. Well, we want to initialize it directly over the top of the old one, so we already know that that's within our parallax carousel over the top of the old swiper instance. And then the second parameter, this is where we would normally list all the parameters that we want to set or enable on our new instance. But we don't need to do that because we've already got a copy of our parameters with everything copied over from the old instance and our parallax parameter set to true. So instead of defining them all here, we simply pass in our new parameters object. So the second parameter becomes carousel params. And that's all we need to do, because by default, when you create a new swiper instance, it will initialize that instance for you automatically. So by defining the location and the parameters, that will already initialize that new instance of swiper over the top of the old one. So that's the end of our code. It's quite a nice, short, concise set of code. That's all we need to do. We now just hit update and store our changes. I've just noticed a small typo in my code there. I don't need a closing bracket there because that matches with this line here, and there's only one opening curly brace, so we only need one closing curly brace just there. Okay, typo corrected. Let's update once more. Okay, so now let's switch back to the front end of our page and refresh. And let's try navigating through the carousel now. And there we have it. Our parallax effect is working. So we can see that on the first slide, all three headings slide in one after the other. On the second slide, the first two headings slide in, and then finally the image slides in over the top of them. And on the third slide, all three images slide in one after the other. So we've got that really nice, smooth, animated effect. And it looks really slick. And there you have it. That's how to build a really nice parallax effect using Elementor Pro and just a few lines of JavaScript code. If you wanted to make things even easier for yourself, if we switch back to the Elementor editor, if we go back to the main WordPress menu, you could actually create the content for these slides as templates. So if you come to templates here in the menu, I don't have any created here myself, but if you wanted to, rather than creating that content directly on the carousel slides, you could create each slide as a separate template and then just insert it using the template widget, which is quite a nice way of centrally managing all the content for your carousel right here in the templates menu. Also, if you wanted to, you don't have to use an HTML widget directly on the page to write your JavaScript code. You could actually use Elementor's custom code feature. So if we come over to Elementor and move down to custom code, you can see here that I've actually already created it here as a custom code snippet. So if you create a new custom code snippet and put all of the same code in here, I recommend setting it to run at the end of the body tag. And then all you need to do is, when you publish it, you'll be asked to set the conditions. So you can set the page where you want your code to run. And the nice thing here is that if you wanted to run that parallax effect on multiple pages, you could maintain one piece of code here as a custom code snippet and then add several conditions for the pages where you want it to run. So here, for example, I've just got it set to run on one singular page, and that is the demo page. But you can add in as many conditions as you want here. And finally, if you wanted to expand your custom development even further and perhaps even try some PHP snippets in future or some CSS snippets, then you should also consider trying the Code Snippets Pro plugin. There's a link in the description down below the video, but let me quickly show you. In here we have the snippets tool already installed. Here we are. I'm just using the free version of Code Snippets at the moment, but this allows you to store all of your snippets in one place. And you can store PHP snippets, and that avoids having to update your functions file. You can create HTML snippets, you can create CSS and JavaScript snippets, and there's even some really nice functionality that lets you back up all of your snippets to the cloud so you can share them across different websites. So that's a really nice plugin, and that's worth considering as well if you feel like extending your custom development even further. So don't forget, there's a link down below in the description below the video where you can download this Parallax demo and easily install it on your own site. So please do have fun with this great new effect, and let us know down below in the comments if you've used it in a creative way on your own site. I'm Chris with King Grizzly. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.